Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line, mainly centered around the Zaporizhia and the northeastern section of it. The Russians have managed to advance within the Zaporizhia section of the front line, while the Ukrainians in a small counterattack managed to regain control over the apartment complex area in this section. The Russians in turn managed to advance in the Toretsk and Chasiv Yar directions west of both cities. The Russians also managed to make an advance within Torske, expanding their zone of control and slowly pushing the Ukrainians out of the town. The Russians also managed to advance within the northern parts of Kupiansk, expanding their foothold within the town. Starting out in the southern section, the Russians continued their advances along the Dacha area and into the town of Flavny, gaining control over approximately half of it. The Russians are advancing both along the Dacha area in the east and the town itself along the coast. The Russians are slowly advancing here to align the front line with the river line to the north and the river line to the west, allowing for a secure flank for offensive operations going alongside the southern bank of the river line and to the flank of the apartment complex area. The Russians previously entered the apartment complex area, entered into the basements of the apartment complex buildings and the buildings themselves. However, the Ukrainians in a counterattack managed to clear them. The southern parts of the apartment complex area does not have a lot of buildings, which left the Russians with a few choices once they entered the settlement. The Ukrainians did not have to clear much, and the main positions of the Ukrainians in the northern apartment complex areas, the Ukrainians had a lot more forces to concentrate and therefore had a significant advantage. The Russians would need to enter into several apartment complex buildings and clear them of Ukrainian soldiers if they want to capture this location. The Russians in turn managed to advance in the eastern parts, gain control over additional forest lines on the eastern flank of the apartment complex area, where they're looking to gain control over both flanks of the area, to flank it from both sides and combine it with an assault directly towards it. Both the eastern and western flanks of it does not really have any locations from which the Russian forces can entrench themselves. The farm, town, in the nearby vicinity is completely wiped out. This means that the Russians would need an armored assault to get into the location and entrench themselves. The Ukrainians naturally have a lot of drones and other operators, which allows them to prevent such armored assaults. There are also forest lines which lead into the location. So based on this, we see that the Russians with a combined assault of infantry and armored vehicles to survive Ukrainian drone strikes, gain a foothold within the apartment complex area, clear them from Ukrainian soldiers, and supply with additional forces until they gain control over it. In the Pokrovsk direction, although there's been no developments since the start of the month, fighting continues in the southern parts in the vicinity of the Shakhtarski district, the southwestern outskirts of Pokrovsk, the town of Troyenda, and even the residential area which is under Russian control. Russian source explained exactly how the fighting takes place here within Pokrovsk and why the front is not moving a lot. The reason for this is, if we see this area here which has been drawn out as Russian control, in these areas there are a lot of Russian soldiers within the different buildings. If every dot represents a group of Russian soldiers, 2, 3, 4 soldiers, then the Russians have a lot of soldiers in it. The Ukrainians in turn still have some soldiers in some of these buildings, in the basements, and the Russians are slowly clearing these buildings. They have control over the vast majority of the area and they're present within the vast majority of it, but they do not know how many Ukrainian soldiers there are and where they are. So they have to go from building to building, clearing every single one, while constantly being targeted by Ukrainian drones and artillery. So they have to move in between these two things. The Ukrainians naturally know where their own soldiers are, as do the Russians. But the Ukrainians are on defense. This means they do not need to move unless they need supplies or they have to withdraw. That means when the Russians have overtaken the area and it's impossible for the Ukrainians to withdraw and they really just need to survive off of what they have, then the Russians do not know where they are and they have to detect them. While doing so, they would have to move around, and while moving around, the Ukrainian strikes can hit them as they are exposed out in the open and not entrenched within a basement or other location. And this is why it's difficult for the Russians to quickly gain control of the area. They would need a lot more forces, and that becomes more costly as they would have a larger concentration in a smaller area, increasing the effectiveness of Ukrainian long-range strikes. And the Ukrainians also have control over the apartment complex areas, which oversees the entire town. The entire southern district of Toretsk, which Russians are present within, is overlooked by these apartment complex buildings, which means soldiers within these can see many of the areas in which the Russian soldiers are. And it's not just about seeing. To explain the line of sight, it's not about seeing your opponents, it's about being able to attack them. In a sense, if you, as a Russian soldier sitting within one of these basements, have a FPV drone operator next to you, and that other soldier detects a Ukrainian soldier in this area right here, then the Russian soldier could leave the building into the field with a sniper rifle. The Russian soldier could shoot the Ukrainian soldier. That is because he would have a line of sight towards it. However, that would put himself outside of his entrenchment out in the open, while a Ukrainian soldier in the apartment complex area would have a line of sight from the building itself as it overlooks the rest of the areas, which means the Ukrainian soldier does not have to leave his entrenchment to attack the Russian soldier. And that is why these apartment complex areas are so complex. They are well fortified, which means high yield bombs do not destroy them. They would need a FAB 3000 or FAB 5000 to destroy one of these buildings. And even so, destroying them would mean that the Russians themselves cannot make use of them once they capture them. So the Russians attempt to damage them with smaller bombs, FAB 500, artillery, and so on, to inflict casualties on the Ukrainians and clear ways for the Russians to enter into these buildings and capture them for their own use. However, this leaves these buildings under the use of the Ukrainians. Even if casualties are inflicted, some still survive and put up resistance, which makes it difficult for the Russians to capture them. So they are making it easier to capture them, but still usable for the future. So as it stands right now, the Russians are slowly moving through the residential area, clearing the basements and the buildings to gain full control of it, consolidate it, following which they'll attempt to gain a foothold within the apartment complex area, move through it, gain control over building after building, clearing those as well, the basements, the different floors, until they gain full control over the apartment complex area, following which they will have positions in the Shakhtarsk district, if they gain full control of it, that overlooks the entirety of the eastern parts of the city all the way up to the railway area. There's the second apartment complex area in the center, which overlooks a wide area in the central parts. They can move into the residential area and industrial area in the northeast, from which they, again, are apartment complex areas and industrial buildings, which can survive pretty much any sort of bomb the Ukrainians have, to which they can concentrate large amounts of forces. And from there on, we see that the Shakhtarsk district is the main area the Russians need control of to gain control over the entirety of the city. Anything else that follows becomes much more doable for the Russian forces if they gain control of the Shakhtarsk district. But again, the Shakhtarsk district is a massive apartment complex area with a lot of defensive fortifications the Ukrainians have, and the Russians are exposed moving all the way up to it before entering it. And that is yet another advantage with drones. Even if you do not have a line of sight, you can still see them from the drone itself. So you need a line of sight from the drone and not from yourself. The artillery is similar, but there's a travel time between the shell and the location. So you need to predict where the soldier is moving, if they're staying, and so on. While a drone strikes instantaneously, it can fly around, it can do reconnaissance, it provides information for artillery. It has everything. The problem with drones is the low firepower that it has, which means it cannot destroy everything. as artillery, MLRS, jets, and so on can do. Moving on to the Toretsk direction, the Russians have managed to advance within Novospassky and Sherpenivka in the northern direction towards Katerinivka and along the railway area. They also managed to recapture the fortifications here to the north of the city in the direction of the industrial area. The Russians are slowly advancing to gain full control over the pocket here along the reservoir in the northern flank of Toretsk, slowly advancing towards Katerinivka, Klebenbek, and the railway area up towards the reservoir, gain control over which will allow the Russians to start offensive operations in the direction of Kupiansk itself from the southeast. In the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to gain control over parts of Mykolaiivka and the forest line and patches area here in the western parts of Chasiv Yar, securing the western flank of it. Russians are slowly pushing in the direction of the settlements along the railway area and to the west of the city in the direction of Kupiansk for the operational encirclement from the north, which indicates the Russians will soon start offensive operations to the west of Kupiansk in the direction of Stepanivka, Dovabelka, Roshkishne, and Mykolaiv for the operational encirclement of Kupiansk, which Russians do not lack a lot of territory now that they have managed to secure Chasiv Yar and are now fighting west of the city. In the direction of Torske, the Russians have expanded zone of control in the southern parts of the town, completely cutting the southern outskirts from the central parts. Deep State map is putting the whole area as a gray zone here to the east of the river line, as the Ukrainians do not have a lot of forces left within the area. According to the Russian source, there are now more Russian soldiers than Ukrainian soldiers within Torske, which gives the Russians the advantage. The Ukrainians still hold the fish farm, and he is implying that the Russians, once they capture the fish farm, they will have control over Torske. They will have secured the northern supply route, and the Ukrainian, one of their main defensive positions, will be captured. The Ukrainian forces still have a significant presence here along the fortified positions east of the town, more than they have in the town itself, which means the Russians gaining control over Torske itself will allow them to encircle the Ukrainian forces, gain control over the area, and have a stable supply line from Kremenna all the way towards Sereshne. Further north in the Kupiansk direction, the Russians expand the zone of control in the northern parts of the town, expanding their foothold within it. The Russians are advancing along the Utsk river line in the eastern parts and are expanding within Moskovka along the railway area. The Russians are here working on expanding the zone of control in the northern parts of the settlement to establish themselves within it. Rightening their positions, we see they have control over some apartment complex buildings and farm areas in the northern parts, but there's not very secure holdings. The Russians would need to establish themselves within the apartment complex area here in the northeastern parts of the settlement. Gaining control over the apartment complex area here will secure the positions for the fighting which will take place in the centrum of the city, as well as the railway area, following which the Russians would have control over the central parts of the city, gain control over which will allow the Russians to start fighting over the apartment complex area in the southwestern parts, and also to cut off the main bridge across the Utsk river line, from which the Russians can start fighting over the eastern parts of Kupyansk, and the Ukrainian concentration of forces in the entire eastern parts of the Utsk river line will be under threat of complete encirclement. Even if the Russians gain full control over Kupyansk, there are still additional bridges. There's also pontoon bridges which can be established. However, Kupyansk itself as the city allows the Russians to significantly improve the logistical situation of their forces, but also the offensive capabilities of their forces, while the Ukrainian defensive capabilities would significantly weaken as a result of it. This means the situation for the Ukrainian forces on the eastern bank of the Utsk river line would turn critical. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.